This is Democracy Here. My name is Maryelen Calderwood, and my guests today are Doug Selwyn and Paul Jablon. Both have vast experience in public education, and both are members of the Education Task Force of Franklin County, continuing the political revolution.
Good news to you I'll tell of how the good old Union has come in here to dwell. Which side are you on, my sisters? Which side are you on? Which side are you on, my sisters? Which side are you on? Which side are you on, my sisters? Which side are you on? Which side are you on, my sisters? Which side are you on? My mother is a feminist and she taught me to see. Until we all have justice, not one of us is free. Which side are you on, my sisters? Which side are you on? Which side are you on, my sisters? Which side are you on? Title VII don't protect me from the pay inequality. I work for the man each day, but the man don't work for me. Which side are you on, my sisters? Which side are you on? Which side are you on, my sisters? Which side are you on? I don't need those corporations.
Hi. It's great for you to be here today. Thanks for taking some time to talk to us on Democracy Here.
Sure.
So I'm really curious about what motivated you, other than your support of Bernie Sanders, to join FCCPR, Franklin County Continuing the Political Revolution.
Well, I moved to town a year plus ago from upstate New York, where I was pretty active in doing both education-related work and other work. And when I came to town, I was looking for a group to get involved with to keep doing that kind of work. And heard that there was the CPR group and went to a General Assembly meeting and hooked up with the Education Task Force at that point. And it was good to find some kindred spirits who were interested in doing this work. So.
And what kind of work did you do specifically in New York?
Well, my job work was I was a professor of education up at SUNY Plattsburgh, but retired. Right. And when I moved down here, well, also I was very involved in organizing around educational issues up in New York. So when I came down here, I was certainly happy to not be working, but I was interested still in education and supporting that. So looking for people to play with.
Great. Well, I think you probably found the right group, right?
I think I have.
And Paul, you're actually the chair of the Education Task Force. And so I know we've talked a little bit about your experience, but I think folks would be interested in knowing sort of where you come from, because you both have varying experiences in public education.
The quick answer to that is I spent 19 or 20 years as a public school teacher in New York City. And it was great experience because although I started out in some fairly horrendous schools, had the opportunity to work with a set of colleagues who were creating schools that were successful with kids who were previously disengaged from school. And after doing that for about 18 or 19 years and seeing that many of the other schools in the city were not using the successful techniques that we had, I then, similar to Doug, went to first Brooklyn College and eventually UMass and then to Lesley University, where I worked both with teachers in their schools and principals and superintendents in their schools, trying to get better practices and figure out together what really worked for all their students, but also having the new people who are training to be teachers understand the best practices. So it's interesting because I finally, after another 25 years of doing that, retired. Because previously for 12 years I commuted all the way to Cambridge every day and really couldn't be involved in politics here in Western Mass where I was living. And it was serendipitous because FCCPR was born just as I retired. And here was a group of people who certainly Their ideas of progressive politics were similar to my own.
So, I mean, it's fantastic. I know I've worked with both of you on the Education Task Force, and it's great to have higher education experience and primary education experience, and both from sort of out of state, too. And so I know that you've done some organizing around particular issues. And some of the issues that the Education Task Force have been tackling have been really sort of encompass all of the issues that public education is facing these days. Either one of you want to talk, maybe, Paul, since you're the chair, sort of maybe some of the topics that you've been sort of grappling with and addressing on the task force?
Sure. I mean, one of the great things about FCCPR in general and the task force is that it is truly the topics that we're going to address come from the people who are either part of FCCPR or, in the case of the task force, we spent 2 or 3 meetings just trying to define what was the core issues we were going to deal with in general that we feel represent FCCPR's vision for education, and then spend time deciding, okay, which ones are most important now in Franklin County. So there were some people who were very interested in early childhood education for everyone. Other people who, of course, looked at public schools, not charter schools, not vouchers, but the true support of public school education and funds that taxpayers are paying going directly there where there are people elected in town or in the city to represent them. There were people who were very interested in free higher education across the state. Then there were people who saw the issue of high stakes testing and how this was undermining public education, actually. And there's a 5th one, and of course...
Civics.
Oh, and civics education.
Right.
And this grew so much out of the past election where students in our schools were coming to us. They actually came to the first FCCPR meetings and said, you know, before this election, and I had gotten a little bit involved with Bernie and supporting him in the election, I didn't even know how politics worked. I didn't know how people got elected. I didn't know any of this. And so we responded to that, to the students, and said, we really are not doing a good job in civics education, obviously, in our schools, if the students who are coming from our schools to FCCPR are saying this.
Right, right. And so some of the things that have changed maybe is we've sort of opened up the conversation about returning civics education to public schools. And when we know, we can probably agree that when kids are educated on politics, when they get to be 18, they register to vote and then they actually vote, which is kind of the fear of folks that want to actually privatize public education. Mm-hmm. There are different ways in which public education is privatized, and sometimes folks don't know that this is actually privatization. So a little bit about vouchers and charter schools and high-stakes testing. Tell me where you think folks that want to privatize public education, how they use those opportunities to do that. How does that work?
Unfortunately, pretty well.
Yeah.
It's a long story. Charters actually began in the 90s in Minnesota, if I'm remembering correctly, and they were actually public schools where people would have the chance to try things out. There was a recognition that schools didn't serve everybody well, and that we might want to try to make some creative approaches that, given the general operation of schools, it was hard to do. So they said, let's take these opportunities to try some things. We'll stretch the rules a little bit, let people try things and see what happens, which actually produced some pretty interesting things. Unfortunately, people who kind of watched this said, we can make some money on this, and moved in and created what is now the general operation of charter schools, saying there are private corporations or private entities that are serving as management and making an incredible amount of money off of the running of charter schools. Many of them are hedge fund type managers, and they often own buildings in which the charters take place, or they have public school space donated to them, and then they rent from themselves the materials that are going to be used. They can't legally decide who stays into a charter school, but because the state pays for each student who is there, pays a certain amount of money, whoever's on record as being part of the charter at the start of the school year, that's how much money they get. And then the charters are able to ease people out the door, especially the students who are more challenging to teach, but they keep the money that they got from the state to begin with. So far from being a laboratory to try out different ways of teaching, it's really become a moneymaker for a number of the people who are involved. The other thing it does is it tends to, many of the charters have waivers in terms of who they hire, and so it ends up being a union busting kind of operation because the people they hire are not necessarily subject to the same contracts as people who are in the teachers' unions.
Yeah. And what kind of work, I know that the Education Task Force sort of started right at the end of the success of the failure of question 2. So I know we've been talking a little bit about charter schools and the Education Task Force, but we've sort of jumped over that and had more of a focus on the high-stakes testing piece, because that's also part of how public schools are privatized. And what kind of work is the task force doing on the high-stakes testing issue? First of all, maybe a little bit of explanation about the difference between high-stakes testing and testing, just general testing.
We can talk about high-stakes testing, but I'd like to go back to charter schools just for
Absolutely.
a minute.
Yeah, we could spend all day on charter schools.
And say that although, as you said, the Proposition 2 had been beaten just before we began in the task force. There was a charter school, not in Franklin County, but just outside of Franklin County in Hampshire County, that was asking to extend. And so as a group in the Education Task Force, we actually met with one of the representatives represented some of Hampshire and some of Franklin County, and told him about this issue and showed him all the statistics about how the students there didn't represent special ed students, it didn't represent ELL students, they actually didn't have any better success with the students they had than the students in the surrounding districts, et cetera. And he actually called up the DESE, the Department of Secondary and Education, and said, we really don't want this school to expand. And in actuality, I don't know if it was because of but certainly a lot of people contacting them and his contacting them, that school actually didn't get expanded, and that wasn't there. So it's an ongoing thing. Just because Proposition 2 was there doesn't mean we don't have to keep going that.
Yeah.
Because the thing that's in Massachusetts is exceptionally debilitating is that charter schools get more per student than public schools get. So if somebody leaves Turner's or Greenfield or Coleraine and they go to a charter school, the district actually has to give the charter school more money than they would be getting for that student in the public school. So it's really draining funds, especially out here where the student population keeps getting smaller. It's such a debilitating thing. And the other thing is we shouldn't just talk about charter schools because we have virtual schools.
Yes.
And with virtual schools, I'm not going to argue that there aren't some students who really need to not be in the public school situation, because there's enough argument that some students don't need to be there. But if you're going to have a virtual school, then have that school created by the teachers in the districts that that virtual school is supporting, and have the curriculum be created by those teachers. It's already there. We need to have some expertise in doing that online. But the kind of guidance and the kind of teaching experience that you have with certified unionized teachers, so it's not, again, ripping away funds from public schools. So there are many, many places that this is happening. And the one that you just brought up, of course, is this whole idea of high stakes testing. Mm-hmm. And I know Doug is much more of an expert on this than I am. And so he can speak to how high stakes testing is equally undermining our public schools.
What's really interesting, and we will get to the high stakes testing piece, but what's really interesting for me is that the Education Task Force is not simply a task force that gets together, and we're not, you're not talking heads where you do research and you talk, and it's an action group. I know that you have both attended the Greenfield School Committee subcommittees. I know that you're actually amazingly at the table helping to create some policy. I mean, you're actually changing the way the public interacts with public elected bodies like school committees.
Well, this is one of the issues, both around high stakes testing and charters, is a loss of local control.
Right.
That the decision-making is made by people who are not in the town, they are not in the district, but the high-stakes testing, the charters, all of that, a lot of those decisions are made in Boston or in Washington, D.C.
Right.
And that one of the ways that communities can retain control of their schools is to show up, is to be voices. One of the things that teachers have been bullied into doing is staying quiet. Administrators as well have been pressured heavily to not talk about some of these issues that are really difficult. But we're retired. Parents aren't employed by districts, and so our voices, they can't silence us so easily. And so getting involved doesn't mean we have the answers, but we can push for at least raising the questions and taking part in the conversation, because what makes a democracy work is having conversation, is getting all the people who are relevant, who have something to say at the table, and having a conversation that's not fear-based, that's not fear-silenced, but that represents the various points of view that people have. That doesn't happen so much in charters. It certainly doesn't happen with vouchers. And high-stakes testing has been one of the silencers of public education, really for the last almost 20 years. So being at the table makes a difference, and you don't have to have, there's a sort of a two-edged sword here. Everybody thinks they know something about education because they have been through it themselves. But you don't have to have worked in education to have some opinions or voice to add to the conversation. So part of what we're hoping to do is help to support the schools by being part of conversations with the goal of saying, how can we serve all of the children as well as possible?
There's always this sensitive question out there and it's always been sort of been a statement that I've heard for quite a long time, is sort of parents make the best deciders of their children's education. And although parents are the overseers of whatever a child does in their lives up until the time they leave the home, is it really true that every parent is probably best equipped to decide the best course of their child's education? Or is it a combination of parents knowing their child and the expertise of teachers who are qualified and those who are the policymakers, et cetera? Is it a combination of knowing what is available, knowing what is good and what is not good, or is it simply the parents know best?
Well, I would say that, first of all, no one person knows best about anything. We all know what we know, and sometimes we've had some good modeling and good experiences and have some good thoughts about things, and sometimes less good. But I think more important, really the direction the country has gone in the last 20 or 30 years is very much a me first. What's good for my kid is what should happen.
Right.
And I think it's one of the reasons we've gone in the direction we've gone, which is that we're less healthy as a population, we're less happy as a population, we have many more people who are in poverty, et cetera, because people are after what's good for me.
Yeah.
And until we have an attitude that says all of our children are all of our children,
Right.
I think we're in trouble. And so what's good for my child may not work for somebody else. One of the things you learn when you teach is there's no one way that everybody learns.
Yeah.
That's what they try to do with the standardization, but it belies how we actually move through the world. If I ask any group I'm talking with about if you have brothers and sisters or if you have more than one child and say, is there any one test, is there any one way you would assess all your kids or all your brothers and sisters, and they would come out exactly the same, people would laugh and then start talking about how different they are. That's the way it is in a classroom.
So, Paul, what about this whole idea of competition, about creating competition? Competition is good in public education. When you translate it to public education, what sort of happens when you create?
Well, competition in the sense of what Doug is speaking to, of there are some teachers in the school who are trying something that they see works really well with a group of kids. And there's other teachers, because there's different kids, as Doug says, who need another approach to it. So I don't talk about that as competition. I talk about that as supplying a variety of platforms in which ways of which to deal with kids. As soon as you have teachers who are being judged on some standardized test, which is not especially measuring what the teachers, the parents, or even experts in education are saying is important, then what you're going to do is have the cutthroat attitude. And that, again, is tearing schools apart. For those of us who worked both as teachers in schools for decades and then had, which was a wonderful opportunity, I got to work from the outside with all these teachers who were trying things. The schools that were most successful were the schools where teachers worked as a community and they were given leeway to, both from the administration and from each other, like, let's try this. This seems to be working really well. And I'll help you with that because I have some skills in that and you have skills in other things. So it's no longer like I'm against you. It's together we can figure this out, but it doesn't have to be standardized. Here's what every teacher's going to do on first period. Here's what every teacher's going to do, an hour and a half later. We have, in the world of education, we have research that shows that is terrible. They did research on that all the way back in the 1960s and 1970s. So this idea that where teachers' salaries are going to be based on how well their students have performed on these standardized tests, it's ripping schools that were such great, warm, inviting, successful places are now like, oh, we got to watch out, I'm going to lose my job. The principal's going to lose their job if we don't do this. It's terrifying.
And we can talk about all the, in terms of competition, we can translate that into school choice too, which was started by Governor Weld. I mean, I transplant here too from New York, so we're all kind of New Yorkers here. I remember as a kid having every supply needed, and gym uniforms even supplied to us, never paying an athletic fee. at all. And I've seen over the course of my life the amount of need go up and the amount of funding go down. And I'm sure part of the concern of the high-stakes testing is all of this public money that could be used to go into actually funding public education is going into the pockets of people that produce some of these tests.
Well, and those people are not educators.
And
they're
they're not
publishers.
right.
And they are for-profit businesses.
Right.
And so part of what's happening is that the public dollars are being drained and going into private hands.
Right.
One of the experiences I had, one of my last elementary classrooms before I went to the university, was working with mostly second language learners, mostly children of recent immigrants, very poor communities. This was in Seattle. And, you know, we did amazing work through the year with that kind of range of approaches that Paul was talking about in terms of what do the kids need and how can we best do that. And it was not read the textbook and answer to questions in the back. And they did really wonderful, creative, interesting things, had a wonderful community, et cetera. When it came time for testing, and this was shortly before they became high stakes, but they were still standardized tests. Mm-hmm. And I don't think there is such a thing as a standardized test, but that's a whole other conversation to have.
I remember the Iowa test. Yeah.
That's right, ITBS. But these kids who are reading in a second or third language would just turn pages.
Yeah.
Page after page after
And disabled
page after
kids too,
page.
right?
Oh, sure. Well, we'll
Yeah.
get. And these were not even talking about kids with special needs. These were children who were trying to read page after page after page in a second or third language to answer questions that were written above grade level for
Yeah.
kids who were native English speakers. And I started realizing that testing is not only simply an annoyance, it's actually harming the children.
So I know you're, we only have about a couple minutes or about a minute left, and I know that pretty soon, Democracy Here is going to be highlighting some of the issues around high-stakes testing. And, you know, in about 30 seconds' time, maybe you could just sort of introduce us to what we're going to be talking about.
Well, because high-stakes testing has entirely turned education upside down, we're going to talk about what it is, how it is different than just standardized testing, which you raised. Barbara Manaloni from the Massachusetts Teachers Union is going to be, or Association is going to be part of the conversation. Monty Neal from Fair Test has been looking at assessment issues for many, many, many years.
And you're going to be the host.
I'll be hosting, and we'll have some parents and some students to talk about what's happening here in Greenfield. What is the experience of high-stakes testing? How has that changed and affected education? And what are our questions, and how might we go about getting more involved in the conversation?
Well, I know we could spend a lot of time on this, but we are out of time. And we're very lucky to have both of you involved in public education locally. So thank you so much for talking to me today, and to all of you. Thank you so much for watching Democracy Here.
Which side are you on, my sisters? Which side are you on? Which side are you on, my sisters? Which side are you on? Come all you northern liberals, taking Klansmen out to dine. The time has come to choose a side and join the picket line. Which side are you on, my sisters? Which side are you on? Which side are you on, my sisters? Which side are you on? Which side are you on, my sisters? Which side are you on? Which side are you on, my sisters? Which side are you on? My father was a carpenter, now he's with the air and sun. But he'll be with his fellow workers till the battle's won. Which side are you on, my sisters? Which side are you on? Which side are you on, my sisters? Which side are you on? They say in Milwaukee, cleansed by Great Lake water, you'll either be a Union man or a thug for Skywalker. Which side are you on, my sisters? Which side are you on? Which side are you on, my sisters? Which side are you on? Which side are you on, my sisters? Which side are you on? Which